Elias stood on the sidewalk outside the grand building, shivering slightly as the cold wind bit at his ears. He pulled his collar up, trying to cover his neck, but it was a useless fight. The jacket he was wearing was the only one he owned that looked even slightly formal, but it had seen better days. It was a thrift store find, dark blue but faded in some spots, and the lining was starting to tear near the left armpit. He looked up at the tall glass doors of the penthouse entrance. Light was spilling out onto the street, and he could hear the faint, muffled sound of laughter and music from inside. This was a world he had only ever seen on TV or in magazines. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He reminded himself why he was here. It wasn't because he belonged here. It was because of luck. A few weeks ago, he had played the piano at a small coffee shop downtown. An elderly man, Professor Miller, had been sitting in the corner. They talked for a long time after the set about music and life. The professor had told him he had potential and had slipped him this invitation, saying, "Go, Elias. You need to be seen. You never know who is listening." Elias suspected the professor just felt sorry for him. Elias was 24, broke, and living in a studio apartment that smelled like mold and old cooking oil. He played piano in hotel lobbies for tips just to buy groceries. As he walked through the doors, the heat hit him instantly. It was a different kind of atmosphere. The air smelled expensive like expensive perfume, roasting meat, and fresh flowers. The lobby was covered in marble, and the floor was so shiny he could see his own reflection in it. A doorman in a bright red uniform looked him up and down. Elias felt his face get hot. He held out the invitation, his paper feeling crumpled compared to the gold foil envelopes everyone else seemed to be holding. The doorman scanned it, raised an eyebrow, but then nodded and stepped aside. "Right this way, sir." Elias walked into the main hall, and his heart sank. The room was massive. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like giant crystal waterfalls, casting sparkles of light over everything. Everywhere he looked, people were holding champagne flutes and laughing. The men wore tuxedos that looked like they cost more than Elias made in a year. The women were in dresses that flowed like water, glittering with diamonds and gold. Elias looked down at his own shoes. They were black dress shoes, but if you looked closely, you could see the scuff marks on the toes where he had tried to polish them too hard with a marker. He tried to walk confidently, sticking to the edge of the room. He grabbed a glass of water from a passing waiter because he didn't want to ask for anything else and didn't have the money to pay for it. He took a sip, trying to look busy, trying to look like he was waiting for someone. But he felt like a sore thumb. He felt like a dirty spot on a clean white shirt. Near the entrance, a group of young men and women were standing in a circle. They were loud and seemed to own the space. One of the men, a tall guy named Victor with slicked back hair and a cruel smile, noticed Elias standing near the wall. Victor nudged the woman next to him and pointed. She giggled behind her hand. "Hey," Victor called out, his voice carrying over the soft music. "I don't think I've seen you at one of these before. Are you with the catering staff?" The group laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh that pulls the ground out from under you. Elias froze. He could feel his ears burning red. He opened his mouth to say something, to explain he was a guest, but his voice felt stuck in his throat. "I think he is," another guy chimed in, smoothing his own expensive silk tie. "The appetizers are running a bit late, mate. Maybe check the kitchen." The laughter grew a bit louder. A few people nearby turned to look. Elias gripped his glass of water tighter. He felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. He wanted to turn around and run out the door. He wanted to go back to his small apartment and hide under his blanket. These people had everything: money, confidence, nice clothes. They had never had to glue the sole of their shoe back on or skip lunch to save for a bus pass. But then, Elias remembered his rent was due next week. He remembered the letter from the bank. He remembered the professor's belief in him. He swallowed the lump in his throat. He didn't answer them. He just straightened his back, lifted his chin, and walked further into the room, away from their laughter. He could still hear them snickering behind his back, and it stung, but he kept walking. He moved through the crowd, dodging conversations about stock markets and vacation homes in Italy. He felt invisible and yet hypervisible at the same time. Everyone seemed to know everyone else, hugging and kissing cheeks. He felt like a ghost floating through a party of living people. Eventually, he found a quieter corner of the room, away from the main crowd. It was dimly lit, and there were fewer people here. And then, he saw it. In the center of the alcove stood a grand piano. It was a beautiful Steinway, black and glossy, looking like a beast waiting to be woken up. It was closed, but just sitting there, it commanded respect. Elias walked toward it slowly. He felt a pull in his chest, a magnetic force. This was the only thing in this room that didn't judge him for his jacket or his shoes. This was the only thing that made sense to him. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches above the cold wood. He wanted to sit down. He wanted to open the lid and play. He wanted to fill this room with sounds so loud that it would drown out the laughter of Victor and his friends. But he was scared. If he played, would they laugh even harder? Would security throw him out for touching the expensive instrument? He stood there, torn between his fear and his desperate need to be heard. He took another sip of his water, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum, waiting for the right moment or the courage to make a move. Elias stood in the dimly lit corner, the grand piano looming before him like a silent, sleeping giant. The rest of the party felt miles away, even though he could still hear the low hum of conversations and the occasional burst of polite laughter from the center of the room. Up close, the instrument was even more beautiful. It was a glossy, deep black, reflecting the soft golden light of the chandeliers above. The white keys looked pristine, untouched, waiting for fingers that knew how to speak their language. Elias's hands twitched at his sides. He could almost feel the cool ivory under his fingertips, imagining the resistance of the keys and the sound that would burst forth if he just let go. He took a small step closer, his worn dress shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. He reached out a trembling hand, letting his fingers hover over the closed fall board. He didn't dare touch it yet. He felt like an intruder in a museum, looking at a priceless artifact behind glass. This piano probably cost more than his parents' house. It belonged here, in a world of luxury and ease. He felt like he did not. He was just a kid from the wrong side of the tracks who got lucky with a ticket. He looked down at his reflection in the shiny side of the piano. He saw his tired eyes, his messy hair that he had tried to comb flat with water, and that tight, fading blazer. He looked small next to the instrument. While Elias was lost in the world of the piano, he didn't notice that eyes were still on him. Across the room, Victor and his group had grown bored of their own conversation. They were scanning the room for something or someone to amuse them. Their eyes landed on the lonely figure in the corner, staring intently at the piano. "Look," Victor said, nudging his friend with his elbow and tilting his head in Elias's direction. "He is still here. I thought he left." A woman in a silver dress, holding a glass of white wine, giggled. "He looks like he's trying to hypnotize it," she whispered loudly. "Maybe if he stares long enough, it will play itself." The group chuckled, a harsh sound that cut through the air. They began to move closer, not to be friendly, but like a pack of wolves circling something weak. They wanted to see how close he would get to crossing the line. Elias sensed movement behind him and snapped out of his trance. He pulled his hand back quickly, hiding it in his pocket, and turned around. His heart skipped a beat when he saw Victor standing only a few feet away, flanked by two other men and the woman in the silver dress. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you," Victor said, his voice smooth but dripping with fake concern. "That is a very sensitive instrument. It's not used to, well, rough handling." One of the other guys snorted, "Yeah, it's for professionals, buddy. Not for beginners." Elias felt the blood rush to his face again. It was happening all over. The shame was hot and prickly. He looked at the floor, wishing he could sink through it. "I wasn't going to play," Elias mumbled, his voice quiet. "I was just looking." Victor stepped closer, invading Elias's personal space. He smelled like expensive cologne and whiskey. "It's okay," Victor said, putting a hand on Elias's shoulder in a way that felt more like a grip than a comfort. "We all have dreams, right? I'm sure you know Chopsticks. Maybe Heart and Soul, that's a crowd pleaser." The woman in the silver dress laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Oh, do that one. I love that song." "I think he might actually be the tuner," the other guy said, scratching his chin. "Hey, is it out of tune? I haven't heard anyone play it all night." "Maybe you should check it for us." The laughter swelled. It wasn't just them anymore, a few people nearby had turned to watch the show. They sipped their drinks and smirked, enjoying the free entertainment at Elias's expense. They saw a poor kid in a cheap jacket being teased by the rich elite, and to them, that was just the natural order of things. It was a power dynamic they were used to. Elias stood frozen. His hands were clenched into fists inside his pockets so tight that his fingernails dug into his palms. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell them that he had practiced piano 4 hours a day for 15 years. He wanted to tell them that he could play pieces so complex they would make their heads spin. He wanted to tell them that while they were busy spending their parents' money, he was working his fingers to the bone just to survive. But the words died in his throat. What was the point? They wouldn't believe him. They would just laugh harder. They would think he was delusional. To them, he was just a prop, a joke to pass the time before the real entertainment arrived. The gap between his world and theirs felt too wide to bridge. He felt incredibly small and incredibly lonely. "Just leave him alone," a soft voice said from behind Victor. Elias looked up, surprised. It was an older woman, maybe in her 60s, standing near a potted plant. She didn't look mean like the others. She looked sad. But Victor just waved her off. "Relax, Eleanor, we're just having a bit of fun," Victor said, turning his smirk back to Elias. "Aren't we, pal?" Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at a spot on Victor's expensive silk tie, trying to hold back the tears that were stinging the corners of his eyes. He knew if he spoke, his voice would crack, and that would be the final humiliation. He had to be strong. He had to take it. "You know," Victor continued, enjoying the silence. "If you're really good, maybe you can play for us later. After the real band finishes. We can pass around a hat for tips." He laughed at his own joke, looking back at his friends for approval. What do you think, $5.10? I'd pay $1 to make him stop, the woman in the silver dress joked. The cruelty of it hit Elias like a physical blow. These people didn't know him. They didn't know his story, his struggles, his late nights, his passion. They only saw his clothes. They only saw what he didn't have. And because of that, they decided he had no value. It wasn't just that they were mean, it was that they were indifferent. They didn't care if they hurt him. To them, his feelings didn't matter at all. Elias looked back at the piano. The black surface was calm and still. It didn't care about his clothes either. It didn't care about money. It only cared about music. For a second, he fantasized about pushing past Victor, sitting down, and playing until the windows shattered. He imagined playing with such fury and skill that their jaws would hit the floor. But the fear was stronger. The fear of messing up, the fear of being mocked even more, kept him glued to the spot. I think I need some air, Elias whispered, more to himself than to them. He turned to walk away, to escape the corner and the judgment, but Victor stepped sideways, blocking his path. Don't go yet, Victor said, his voice dropping, losing the fake friendliness. The party is just getting started. Stay and mingle. Or, stand there and look at the piano. It's funny to watch. The trapped feeling tightened in Elias's chest. He felt like a mouse cornered by a cat that wasn't hungry, just bored. He looked around the room, desperate for a way out, but everyone was just watching, waiting to see what he would do. The piano sat behind him, silent and waiting, like the only friend he had in a room full of enemies. He took a shaky breath, his heart pounding so loud he was sure Victor could hear it. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew he couldn't stay in this corner forever. Something had to give. The awkward tension in the corner was thick enough to choke on. Elias was still standing there, trapped by Victor's imposing frame and the cruel smiles of his friends. He felt like a small animal caught in a trap, looking for any way to escape. Just as he opened his mouth to mumble an excuse and push past them, a sharp screech of feedback pierced through the air, making everyone in the room flinch. The microphone near the center stage had been turned on. A hush fell over the crowd as a tall, distinguished man with silver hair stepped up to the podium. It was Mr. Sterling, the billionaire who owned the penthouse and the company. He adjusted his glasses and tapped the mic lightly. "Good evening, everyone," he said, his voice booming through the speakers. "I hope you are all enjoying the food and the company." There was a polite round of applause. Elias used the distraction to take a small step back, trying to put a few inches of distance between himself and Victor. Victor didn't stop him, distracted by the announcement. He crossed his arms, looking annoyed that the center of attention had shifted away from his cruel game. "I have a bit of disappointing news," Mr. Sterling continued, his face looking serious. "We have just received a call that our headline pianist, the renowned artist we flew in from Europe, is stuck at the airport due to the severe storm hitting the coast. His flight has been grounded, and unfortunately, he will not be able to join us tonight." A collective groan rippled through the room. People looked at each other with disappointment. The music had been the main event for the evening. It was what they had all been waiting for after dinner. The atmosphere in the room instantly changed. The energy seemed to drain away. People started checking their watches, perhaps wondering if they should leave early or go to the bar. Without the entertainment, the party felt incomplete. "I apologize deeply for this inconvenience," Mr. Sterling said, holding up his hands. "We are trying to find a solution, but it seems we will be without a performance tonight. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He felt relieved. It meant the spotlight wouldn't be on the piano. It meant he could just fade into the background and eventually slip away unnoticed. He turned his head slightly, looking for the exit signs. He just needed to wait for the right moment. But fate, it seemed, had a different plan. From right behind Elias, a voice rang out loud and clear. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, we might have a solution right here." It was Victor. Elias's heart stopped. He slowly turned around to see Victor pointing a finger directly at his chest. The cruel smirk was back, wider than ever. "There is a young man right here who has been obsessing over our piano all night," Victor announced, his voice carrying across the now quiet room. He turned to the crowd, laughing. "I told him earlier to be careful with it, but I think he's dying to play for us. Isn't that right?" The room shifted. Hundreds of eyes turned to look at the dim corner where Elias stood. The spotlight from the stage didn't reach him, but the attention of the crowd was brighter than any light. Elias felt his legs turn to jelly. He could see the faces turning toward him, confused, amused, curious. Mr. Sterling looked into the shadows, squinting slightly. "Is that so?" he asked. He sounded hopeful, not realizing the trap being set. "We do have a beautiful Steinway. Do we have a musician in the house?" Victor nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, absolutely. He's been hovering over it like a moth to a flame. I'm sure he's just been shy." He looked at Elias, his eyes daring him to speak up. "Go on, kid. Don't be shy. Tell the man. You play, right?" The laughter started again. It was a low, rumbling laughter from Victor's group, but it spread quickly. People didn't know exactly why they were laughing, but they laughed because the rich people were laughing. It was the sound of social exclusion. They thought Elias was a waiter, or a guest's son, or someone who didn't belong. The idea of him playing the grand piano for a room full of billionaires was the punchline of a joke they all understood. Elias's mouth went dry. He looked at Mr. Sterling, who was waiting for an answer. The billionaire looked tired and genuinely wanted to save his party. Elias felt a wave of pity for the man, mixed with his own terror. He knew this was a setup. If he said no now, he would look like a coward. If he said yes and played badly, he would be humiliated and laughed out of the building. If he said yes and played well, he still might be mocked for his appearance or his background. There was no winning move. Elias started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, but the words stuck. He looked at the exit door, just 20 feet away. He could run. He could drop his glass and bolt into the elevator. But he didn't move. His feet were rooted to the floor. "Come on!" someone shouted from the back of the room. "Give it a try. Let the boy play." A woman near the front chimed in. She was tipsy and clapping her hands. The pressure mounted. It wasn't just Victor now, it was the whole room. They wanted entertainment. They didn't care if he was good or bad, they just wanted a show. To them, he was just another object in the room, like the ice sculptures or the flower arrangements. He was there to serve a purpose. Victor took a step closer to Elias, lowering his voice so only Elias could hear. "You have two choices," he whispered, his breath smelling of mint and arrogance. "You walk up there now, or I make a scene and have security drag you out for touching the property without permission. Your call." Elias looked into Victor's cold eyes and realized there was no escape. the humiliation was inevitable. The only thing he could control was how it happened. He could either run away with his tail between his legs, proving them right that he was nothing, or he could face them. He could walk up to that monster of a piano and pour his heart out, even if they laughed at the end. He thought about his mother, who had worked 2 jobs to buy him his first cheap keyboard when he was 6. He thought about the years of practice, the blisters on his fingers, the nights he fell asleep at his keyboard because he had nowhere else to go. He thought about the music. It was the only thing that had never abandoned him. Elias straightened his spine. He pulled his shoulders back. He ignored the way his jacket pinched his armpits. He ignored the scuff marks on his shoes. He looked Victor in the eye and saw a flicker of surprise. Victor hadn't expected him to stand tall. Elias turned away from the bully and walked toward the center of the room. The crowd parted like water, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. As he walked out of the shadows and into the light, he could hear the whispers starting up again. Is he really going to do it? He looks terrified. Maybe he knows a song or two. Elias reached the piano. It sat there, gleaming and imposing, like a judge waiting for a verdict. He turned around to face the room. He saw hundreds of faces staring back at him, some bored, some mocking, some expectant. He saw Victor leaning against a pillar with his arms crossed, a smirk plastered on his face, waiting for the disaster to unfold. Mr. Sterling gave him an encouraging nod from the side of the stage. "Whenever you are ready, son," the billionaire said kindly. Elias took a deep breath. He pulled out the adjustable bench. He sat down, the leather cool against the back of his legs. He reached up and, with trembling fingers, unlocked the key cover. He slowly lifted the lid, revealing the black and white keys. The silence in the room was absolute. He could hear his own blood rushing in his ears. He hovered his hands over the keys for just a second, closing his eyes. He blocked out the faces, the chandeliers, the expensive clothes, the judgment. He imagined he was back in his small apartment, with the rain tapping against the window, playing for himself and no one else. He opened his eyes. The fear was still there, sitting heavy in his stomach, but underneath it was a burning fire. He wasn't here to entertain them anymore. He was here to prove he existed. Elias didn't start with a gentle tune. He didn't play a soft introduction to warm up his fingers or test the keys. He didn't give the room a moment to settle or prepare. Instead, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a split second to find his center, and brought his hands down hard on the keys. The sound that exploded from the piano was like a thunderclap. It was a massive, crashing chord that seemed to shake the very floor of the penthouse. It wasn't just noise, it was raw power. The people standing closest to the stage flinched physically, some of them spilling their drinks as the vibrations hit their chests. The woman in the silver dress froze with her glass halfway to her lips, her eyes widening in shock. For a second, there was total silence in the room, interrupted only by the ringing echo of that first chord. Then, Elias's right hand began to move. He launched into a piece that was incredibly difficult, a storm of notes that cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall of glass. It was fast, aggressive, and technically demanding. This wasn't the polite background jazz they expected from a waiter. This was a mastery of the instrument that required years of brutal, relentless practice. Elias's fingers were a blur. They moved independently of each other, striking the white keys and the black keys with a precision that was terrifying to watch. The room went completely still. The low hum of conversation that had filled the air just moments ago vanished instantly. Waiters stopped serving trays. Guests stopped checking their phones. Every single pair of eyes locked onto the young man in the faded blazer. They weren't looking at him with pity or amusement anymore. They were staring because they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Elias didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Victor, and he didn't look at Mr. Sterling. He stared straight ahead, his focus entirely locked on the music. He was pouring everything he had into the instrument. He thought about his tiny apartment with the paper-thin walls where the neighbors would bang on the pipes when he practiced too late. He thought about the cold winter walks home from the conservatory because he couldn't afford the bus. He thought about the rejection letters and the people who told him to give up and get a real job. All that anger, all that hunger, and all that passion flowed through his arms and out of his fingertips. The piano roared. The lower notes were heavy and dark, rumbling like a coming storm, while the higher notes were sharp and piercing, cutting through the air like a cry for help. The music was intense, filled with a drama that captivated the room. It was a story of struggle, and in that moment, Elias was telling his story without saying a single word. Victor stood near the pillar, his arms still crossed, but his smirk had completely evaporated. He looked at the piano, then at Elias's hands, and then back at his friends. His friends weren't laughing anymore. Their mouths were slightly open, their drinks forgotten in their hands. They exchanged confused glances, unable to process what was happening. The joke had turned into a master class, and they were the ones who looked foolish now. Victor shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking uncomfortable. He tried to maintain his air of superiority, but the sheer power of the music made him feel small. As the piece progressed, the tempo increased. Elias's left hand was jumping up and down the keyboard in huge, powerful leaps, while his right hand weaved complex melodies that sounded like they were being played by three people at once. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. His breathing became heavy and rhythmic, matching the intensity of the performance. The cheap blazer was starting to feel like a straitjacket, restricting his movement, but he didn't stop. He pushed through the discomfort, channeling his physical struggle into the emotional weight of the music. Mr. Sterling, the host, had walked closer to the stage. He stood near the edge of the piano, watching Elias's hands with a look of total fascination. He was a man who owned many expensive things and had seen the best entertainers in the world, but he recognized true greatness when he saw it. He could see that Elias wasn't just playing notes on a page, he was improvising, adding little flourishes and accents that showed a deep, instinctual understanding of the music. The billionaire nodded slowly, a small, genuine smile forming on his face. He realized that the disappointment of the evening had turned into something much rarer, a moment of discovery. The music began to slow down, shifting from the frantic storm into a softer, more haunting melody. The change in mood was palpable. The heavy chords became gentle, and the rapid notes turned into long, singing tones. The quiet in the room was even heavier now. People were leaning in, not wanting to miss a single sound. The contrast between the loud, angry beginning and this soft, sad ending was heartbreaking. It was the sound of exhaustion, of a fighter taking a breath after a long battle. Elias pressed the sustain pedal, letting the notes blend together into a wash of sound. He looked down at the keys, his expression softening. For a moment, he forgot he was in a room full of billionaires. He forgot about the scuffed shoes and the rent money. He was just a musician, and his piano was singing. The connection between him and the instrument was absolute. It was a private moment happening in a very public place, and the guests felt privileged to witness it, even if they didn't quite understand why. Near the back of the room, a young man put his arm around his date, pulling her closer. The cynical, business-like atmosphere of the party had completely dissolved. The barriers that people put up, the social circles, the hierarchies of wealth didn't exist anymore. The music was too strong for them. It leveled the playing field. In the face of such raw talent, $1 billion didn't make you any better or worse than the person playing the piano. Elias felt the energy of the room shift. He could feel that he had them. He knew that no one was laughing now. The knowledge gave him a surge of adrenaline. He attacked the final crescendo with renewed vigor. His hands flew up and down the keyboard, the rhythm becoming driving and insistent. The volume swelled, filling the massive hall until it felt like the walls were vibrating. Victor and his group had shrunk back into the shadows. They were no longer the center of attention, they were irrelevant. The cruel things they had said were forgotten, drowned out by the flood of music. They looked awkward and out of place, realizing that for the first time that night, they were the ones who didn't belong. The social power had shifted, and it was now entirely in the hands of the young man in the thrift store blazer. Elias didn't hold anything back for the finale. He played the final chords with a force that was almost violent, slamming his hands onto the keys and then lifting them high into the air. The last note hung in the air, echoing off the marble walls and the high ceiling, ringing out like a bell. He held his pose, chest heaving, hands frozen above the keys, waiting for the sound to fade into nothingness. He didn't dare turn around. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, waiting for the judgment that was about to come. For a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the room stayed completely silent. The last vibrations of the final piano note hummed in the air, disappearing into the high ceilings. Elias sat frozen on the bench, his hands hovering over the keys. He was afraid to move. He was afraid to turn around. His heart was hammering so hard against his ribs that he thought it might bruise them. In the quiet, his doubts came rushing back. Had he played too loudly? Had it been too aggressive? Maybe they were just shocked into silence because a poor kid had dared to make such a scene. He braced himself for the booze, or worse, the laughter. He imagined Victor's voice cutting through the air, mocking him for trying so hard. But then, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was Mr. Sterling. He was standing near the front of the crowd, clapping slowly and deliberately with a look of pure admiration on his face. He wasn't just being polite, he was applauding with conviction. "Magnificent," the older man whispered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. That was the spark the room needed. Suddenly, the silence broke. Another person joined in, then two more. Within moments, the applause spread like a wave across the entire hall. It wasn't the polite, thin clapping you hear at a boring speech. It grew rapidly into a roar. People started cheering. Some of the guests put their drinks down on tables so they could clap harder. A man in the back let out a loud, "Bravo!" Elias sat there, stunned, his back still to the crowd. The sound washed over him, warm and overwhelming. It wasn't laughter. It was appreciation. Slowly, Elias turned around on the bench. He looked out at the sea of faces. The sneers were gone. The mocking smiles had vanished. The people who had looked through him 10 minutes ago were now looking directly at him, their eyes wide with respect and wonder. He saw the woman in the silver dress. She wasn't giggling anymore. Her hand was covering her mouth, and her eyes looked slightly watery, as if the music had touched a nerve she didn't know she had. Then, Elias's eyes found Victor. The bully was standing near the back, his arms still crossed, but his posture had changed. He looked smaller. He wasn't leaning casually against the pillar anymore, he was standing stiffly. The smirk was wiped off his face, replaced by a look of shock and perhaps a tinge of embarrassment. He looked down at his expensive shoes, unable to meet Elias's gaze. The dynamic had flipped in an instant. Victor, with all his money and connections, had been unable to touch Elias, but Elias's talent had silenced the whole room, including Victor. Elias stood up. His legs felt shaky, like jelly, but he forced himself to stand tall. He gave a small, awkward bow. He didn't know how to act in this moment. He wasn't used to being the hero. He was used to being the one who cleared the tables or played in the corner while people ignored him. Mr. Sterling walked up the steps to the small stage area. The crowd parted for him, giving him space. The billionaire reached out and shook Elias's hand firmly. It wasn't a limp handshake of a man used to being served, it was the grip of one man acknowledging another. "That was extraordinary," Mr. Sterling said, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "I have heard many pianists in my life, Elias. I have paid fortune for famous orchestras. But I have never heard anyone play with that much heart. You told a story tonight. You didn't just play notes." Elias felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't find the words to respond, so he just nodded, managing a weak "thank you, sir." "Where did you learn to play like that?" Mr. Sterling asked. "I taught myself, mostly," Elias said softly, his voice finally steady. "And I practiced anywhere I could. On old uprights in schools, in community centers, wherever they let me." Mr. Sterling smiled broadly. He turned to the crowd, raising Elias's hand up like a prizefighter. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a waiter. This is a prodigy who walked in off the street because he loves music more than anything." The applause started up again, even louder this time. A few people whistled. Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. For the first time in his life, he felt seen. He felt like his struggles had meant something. The years of being invisible, the nights of going to bed hungry, the shame of not fitting in, it all crystallized into this moment of validation. "I don't want this night to end without offering you something," Mr. Sterling said, turning back to Elias and lowering his voice. "I host these events often. I own several hotels. We have entertainment, but frankly, most of it is boring background noise. I want you to play for us. I want to hire you as a resident pianist for my main hotel lobby. You can name your price." Elias blinked. He thought he might be dreaming. You want to hire me, but look at me," he gestured to his frayed jacket. "I don't even have a suit." Mr. Sterling waved his hand dismissively. "We can buy you a suit, Elias. We can buy you 10 suits. We can't buy that kind of talent. I pay for excellence, and you just proved you have it in spades." The offer hung in the air, sweet and unbelievable. It was a lifeline. It was a future. Elias looked at the crowd, then back at the piano, and finally at Mr. Sterling. "I would be honored," he said, his voice clear and strong. As the party began to resume, the atmosphere was completely different. People started coming up to Elias, introducing themselves, shaking his hand, asking him where he studied. They didn't see the thrift store clothes anymore, they only saw the artist. Victor and his group had quietly slipped away into the crowd, no longer interested in a target they couldn't bully. About 20 minutes later, Elias decided it was time to leave. He had had enough excitement for one lifetime. He politely declined a glass of champagne and made his way toward the door. Mr. Sterling insisted on taking his number, promising to have his assistant call him first thing in the morning to discuss the contract. Elias walked out of the penthouse and into the cool night air. The city lights were twinkling below him, and the wind was colder than he remembered, but he didn't shiver. He buttoned his cheap, faded blazer. It was the same jacket he had worn when he walked in. The shoes were still scuffed. He still had to take the bus back to his small apartment. In reality, his circumstances hadn't changed yet. He was still broke in that exact moment. But as he walked toward the elevator, he realized he felt completely different. He walked with his head up. His shoulders were back. The shame was gone. He had walked into a room that tried to chew him up and spit him out, and he had conquered it not with money, but with the thing he loved most. He had proven to himself, and to everyone else, that he belonged. He stepped into the elevator and caught his reflection in the mirror. He smiled at himself. It wasn't the smile of a scared boy anymore. It was the smile of a man who knew his worth. The scuffed shoes didn't matter. The jacket didn't matter. The laughter didn't matter. He was Elias, the pianist. And the world was finally ready to listen.